So first and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. This session is Mental Health, What Are Employers' Obligations, to be presented by the wonderful Jodie Hill, founder of Thrive Law. I'm Danny Clark, I'm founder of Simply People, so you would have seen my posts potentially related to this webinar. And we do have other webinars moving forwards that are available on our website, so please do check those out. And we have more going live over the next few weeks. But you're not here to listen to my dulcet tones, you are here to listen to Jodie. I take no offence by that. So I will just cover off the quick introduction. So Jodie qualified as a barrister and later cross-qualified as a solicitor in 2013, and she has founded multi-award winning Thrive Law in 2018. During lockdown, Jodie's created her own wellbeing platform, which is called Thrive Wellbeing, and that's designed to support her and her clients with mental health support and training for free. She's also the chair of This Is Me Yorkshire, a business-led campaign focused on opening the conversation around mental health by sharing personal experiences, including her own journey from mental breakdown to breakthrough. Jodie joined the Law Society Employment Law Committee in 2020, and she regularly appears on BBC 5 Live and other radio stations, taking questions live on air and providing her expert advice to the nation on employment law topics and changes in the law to provide clarity for the community. On a personal level, I'm really pleased that we've managed to secure Jodie's time because she is very, very popular. I'm sure that you'll, to be honest, and I'm sure that you'll really benefit from this session. We are open to questions. You'll find at the bottom of the screen a question and answer section. So please, if you do have any questions, fire them through that device or an application at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to answer them. If we do run out of time, I promise that we will come back to you on those questions, and we'll follow up with an email post-event with the answers. Following on from the event, for those that do require CPD certificates or certificates of attendance, please do let us know and we'll share those as well. Enjoy the session, and Jodie, over to you.
Are you recording it?
It is being recorded, yeah.
Fabulous. Just checking. No, thank you so much. I'm going to keep my camera on whilst presenting. I know some people turn it off, but I get a bit animated.
I'm going to turn mine off.
You can turn yours off. So we are going to do some, like Danny said, it's interactive, so please do ask questions. No question is a stupid question, and I'll probably deal with most of them at the end, so Danny can help me field those. We're also going to do some polls as well, just to gauge a little bit about what you guys are doing. So let me just get started then. So that's a picture of me. We know what I look like. Okay, so really for me, mental health has been at the top of business agendas for many years. But I think more recently, what we've found is that there are so many more stressful factors, not just because of lockdown, but generally, and I've put a list here on the slides, but generally for financial worries, uncertainty around work, and whether you're a business owner or an employee, that uncertainty can cause excessive stress. And what we found is that people are really struggling this time around with lockdown, especially with social isolation, because they can't go out on an evening or a morning because the days are darker and shorter. People are really concerned specifically about health. I know up in Leeds, where I'm based, it's much worse than it was in the first lockdown. So it's actually a bit of it's a very different feeling for people. And actually, I think people are just less resilient at the moment because we've been through so much this year, and there's only so much you can take. So it's really important to consider all these extra things that we're having to deal with at the moment, which ordinarily we wouldn't be, but also as an employer and an employee, what your colleagues are going to be feeling like. And everybody's on a different journey at the moment. So it's really important that we do consider all of these factors. But equally, we have less access to things like psychological care and support, and that's really important to understand, because some people heavily rely upon seeing their psychiatrist or their therapist, and they haven't been able to see them because of lockdown or because of social distancing measures. And that can be, well, it can be really detrimental to those individuals because that's their support line. So there may be people within your workplace who are going through that and you just don't know about it. So it's just being mindful that people are very much on a very different journey. What I always describe it as, we're all in the same storm but on a different boat. And actually, if we keep that in mind when we talk about mental health, it's really helpful. So the typical workforce when we were kind of normal prior to lockdown was that we were all visibly there. We could see each other, we could spot behavioural signs. We could also have those little conversations with people where you check in. So the kind of, how are you? How was your weekend? That kind of thing. I feel like that's gone a little bit with home working. It's also much more difficult to communicate because individuals, specifically more junior, what I'm finding through our clients and through staff actually feeding back, is that they don't want to bug people. In the office, they might have been able to absorb information through osmosis and actually just pick up things because they're actually sat there next to a partner and they've overheard, and then they know how to say it. So what we're finding is that that causes anxiety in itself, and individuals are really struggling to articulate that and communicate that because they don't want to be a burden. So it's really important that we as business owners and as managers understand how to manage those relationships and try to foresee some of those issues, because if we don't do that, we will actually end up in it, not only individuals being on long-term sick, which obviously is not helpful for the individual or the employer, but also it will have a profound impact on the entire team, especially when businesses are struggling at the moment. What we also found massively actually was about monitoring, because I think when people work from home there's a bit of a trust issue. So you've got the communication side, but then you've got how do you monitor work, and monitoring work when you're in the office you can see that people are working, so you don't really monitor it, you kind of just know that they're working. But when you are working from home or you've got people who are furloughed, you know, trying to communicate with them and understanding what they're actually doing is really difficult. So you do need to consider that when we are in this different world, because actually that has an impact on individuals, both for their mental health, but also their productivity. And like I said before, we can, when you can physically see someone, even the behavioural signs, if they're sat like this with their head in their hands, or you know, they're potentially more quiet, or they're not engaging in conversations like everybody else is, those are the signs that we're now missing. And that's really difficult for employers to manage, because you've got a really fine line of communicating effectively and micromanaging. So what we try to do is find that balance, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's actually about understanding the best way to communicate with each individual within your team, which I'll come on to. So I've talked about the impact of lockdown, and I think, you know, ultimately we could all agree, I don't think anybody finds lockdown enjoyable. I don't think anyone is finding it easy, to be honest. And the reality is lots of things are getting lost in translation. What we're finding is difficult conversations are more difficult to have when you're remote. So for example, a disciplinary or a grievance that might ordinarily take place face to face is taking place through video call, and there's less interpersonal relationships happening during work time, and that can be really challenging for a lot of people. And like I said before, that interaction between both the employer and the employee is definitely reducing. And if it doesn't reduce, it's kind of, are you then sending loads and loads of emails, which is really overwhelming? So the way that we communicate and the frequency and the tone of that communication is really, really important, especially when we are less visible at home. I've talked about the fact that it is more difficult, and you know, at the moment I don't see that improving anytime soon, especially with the tiered restrictions. So we really need to think about, well, what do we do about that? So we know that there's a problem. We know that mental health is declining. I'm doing a white paper on the impact of COVID on mental health at the moment, and quite frankly the statistics are really shocking. Suicide rates are up, and there is less access to psychological care, which I talked about before. So because of that, what we're finding is that's bringing itself into the workplace. Well, the workplace being your home. You know, I'm sat here today, you know, my house doing this webinar for you guys, and the reality is we are tending to work a little bit more now, for those people who are still working, because we're at home and we don't have that divide. So we do need to make sure as managers that people stop working at a certain time. I'm quite firm with my team about their hours. I don't want them working all hours of the night. I'm really passionate about that, because I don't think they're productive if they're working all the time. They should be able to do their job within those hours. And it's really easy just to nip on and do another email, and actually, you know, as a manager, you're like, oh, actually that's really helpful, but we do have to manage that and manage that expectation. downwards by practicing what we preach, but also by actually communicating what you expect from those individuals. So encouraging people to take breaks and things like that is really important. And actually making sure, and if, I mean, most of you have probably already done this, but it's something that has come up a few times with people that have approached us, is that they haven't amended their policies for access remotely. So, for example, disciplinaries and grievances, how will that manifest if it actually happens? If someone has a grievance, who do they speak to? Because ordinarily, you know, that person might be furloughed. So just being mindful that your policies and procedures might need updating temporarily, or at the very least, some communication about what people do if they have a problem. If you have mental health first aiders, which most of our staff at Thrive are trained in mental health first aid, then it's really helpful to communicate who those people are, how they can get in touch with them. And obviously, if you do have any initiatives running within the organisation, making everybody aware of what those initiatives are, how they get involved. So that might be an EAP, so that's an employee assistance programme. It might be that you've got trained first aiders. It might be that you're running another initiative, that's some kind of training portal, or whatever it is. Just make sure people know about it and know how to access it. What we find a lot of the time is that employers have the best will in the world, but people don't know what's happening. And so that communication piece is really, really important. So one of the things that I have found that we do as Brits is we just say, hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, you fine? Yeah, I'm fine. And actually the reality is we're not fine, and we say we're fine. And so what I try and stick to, especially with my team, is I'll ask them how they're feeling rather than how are they. And I also ask them more than 3 times, not kind of bugging them and you know, getting right in their face about, you know, are you sure you're okay? It's more about actually questioning them about how they're feeling, rather than just a passive, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine. Actually understanding how are you feeling today? Because actually some days it is a rubbish day, and it's okay to feel like that, and explaining to them and normalizing that conversation, explaining to them that that's okay, is really, really powerful. Because then if they aren't feeling great, then they can talk about that. It might not be with you, it might be with someone else in the organization, but actually normalizing the conversation about feelings and emotions, and normalizing and breaking the stigma around mental health is really important. And it takes a long time to get to that point, but the little things like asking 3 times and putting initiatives in place can be really, really beneficial. So the other thing that we found so helpful, because we're not seeing people as much, because we don't see the visible signs, the behavioural signs, and we're not communicating as frequently with our staff, what we found is actually we need to ask in another way. Because, you know, you can ask people a few times, they might not tell their manager how they feel. Some people, if you don't have that workplace culture that's really open about mental health, then it's unlikely that someone will necessarily open up. So if that's the case, and it is the case for the majority of organisations still, because unfortunately stigma is still there, then there are ways that you can get around that. We've been using a risk assessment. So there's 2 types of risk assessments. One is around mental health and wellbeing, which is non-mandatory under legislation. I'm actually campaigning for the law to be changed so that the government will help businesses with this. At the moment, the only risk assessment you legally have to do is a stress risk assessment, not a mental health and wellbeing one. So I personally don't think that the stress one goes far enough to help employers. And it's like a little form on the HSE, so that's the Health and Safety Executive website. So you can download that for free, it's on there. But I don't think it really helps you as much as you could, you know, as much as you could do through a different type of assessment and actually asking better questions. So I found a company who does them finally, and it's really helpful, because I'll explain how the assessment works. So the purpose of the risk assessment is to understand, first of all, whether or not your team is struggling and where the support is needed. So it's all anonymous online, and the idea is that they are going to be more open because they're not talking to their manager. It also massively reduces time for managers, because it's an online interactive risk assessment that they do themselves in isolation without a manager there. What happens as a result of that, the individual will go through a series of questions, and it's actually really relevant for physical health as well, because it talks about musculoskeletal, talks about energy, nutrition, all sorts of different areas, as well as stress and mental health, because obviously all of these things feed into each other. And what it does is it allows the individual to get a bespoke report that indicates exactly 3 areas that they need to work on. So, it might even just be drinking more water, or sleeping more, or drinking less coffee, but there's some physical things that they might be able to do in order to reduce stress levels. So it's really helpful because it gives a responsibility to the individual, and it's very bespoke because it's on their answers. And if there is a risk, so for example, if somebody's at risk of suicide or they're very, very high risk, it signposts them to appropriate support. So what we found is that individuals, some of my clients have used it, and they've identified, they didn't know that they had people in their workplace that were suicidal, and they found out 25% of them were, which is quite a high percentage. But even just finding out one of your staff is suicidal that you didn't know about, this could be the difference between saving a life and actually making a real difference. So that's the first part of the assessment, and that's obviously great for the individuals. But as a business owner, what I love about it, and I pay to use these because I actually think it's a great tool, is that they give you an understanding of the whole workforce, of where they need the most support. So it gives you a percentage. So kind of like how the individuals get their 3 things they have to work on, the employer gets 3 things. So it might be actually 65% of your staff are struggling with sleep, or it might be workplace workload, or whatever it is, it identifies it. So rather than you putting on an initiative, say free yoga or free fruit, how do you know that your staff aren't doing enough yoga, or that you're not eating enough fruit? It can be a wasted initiative. And so the point of the risk assessments is to really target those initiatives so that you actually spend the money where it's needed and your employees feel heard. And I think it's really important that we start to take this approach, where if we're not already doing it, because it can seem tokenistic if you don't. And actually, if you're going to do something, it might as well be something that's actually going to have a real benefit. And what better way to find that out than actually ask your staff? So even if you don't want to pay for a system to do it, you can come up with a survey that can ask some of these questions that actually can help you to understand where you need to spend that money, because it's an investment. Investing in people's mental health is so important, because ultimately you don't have a business without your staff. So you need to invest in their mental health, and actually the best way to do it is to ask them what support they need. If anyone has any questions about the risk assessments, I'm happy to chat a little bit more about that at the end. So the next thing I'm really passionate about is self-care. And I think this can sometimes come across as a bit like, I'm a hippie, like self-care, meditate, that kind of thing. Self-care is whatever works for you and for your team. So the first thing I do is I work out when we first went into lockdown, I really struggled with my mental health. So I've got anxiety and PTSD, and I've managed it quite well since I set my firm up 2 years ago. But as Danny said, I actually set my firm up off the back of having a mental breakdown, and I learned a lot through that. But it helps as well that I'm actually a specialist solicitor in discrimination legislation, and I'll come on to that in a little while. But effectively, a mental health condition in the workplace can amount to a disability. So it's really important that, first of all, as a business owner, I look after myself and I practice what I preach, because if I'm not doing that, then the staff won't do that. So it is really important. And even though it's really difficult, because we're all in challenging circumstances and we obviously want to work as many hours as possible to kind of survive at the moment, and I've certainly been there. I don't think I've ever worked more than I have this year. But the reality is we need to make that time for self-care, because if I don't do that, then there isn't a business. I'm a very small organisation. There aren't any other directors. And the reality is we have to do that for ourselves and practice what we preach. So, find what works for you. I personally love to have a bath, and I love to yoga, and I need to have 8 hours sleep. There are certain things that I just know work for me. And I also have to exercise every day and go outside every day. There are certain things that I just make sure I always do to keep me resilient and to keep me mentally strong. And I think we need to encourage our staff to do that as well. It's really easy for people to get stuck in a rut when they're working from home, because they're not necessarily having that coffee break that they would have with their chat with their friends about what's happened at home. They might not be talking about things. So making sure that they find what works for them, and just encouraging them on that. So you can put initiatives on around that. You can also, one of the things, there's loads of different things that you can do to encourage self-care, but there are like inspiration cards that you can get people. You can put all sorts of different initiatives in place, and I'm happy to share some of the stuff that we've done with anyone if they want to speak to me separately. But ultimately, it's about making it clear that individuals have a responsibility too. We all have a responsibility to look after our own mental health, and it's really difficult at the moment. So if some of my staff, if they've been working late and I see they've emailed me like 8 o'clock, I actually email them. I'm like, you didn't need to send that then. Did not need to send that email then. And getting them out of the habit of just doing it because they're at home, and actually making them aware. Like, for example, I'll have a meeting at, say, I don't know, 11 o'clock. I'll say, right guys, make sure you go outside for lunch, make sure you take a lunch. We get into the habit of just eating at our desks, and those really small bits of self-care can be really powerful, and not just in terms of mental health but in productivity. We all know that if we take a break, I mean, I go for a walk for an hour every day, and I do have to do some emails sometimes, and I sometimes have to take calls, but I get outside and I make sure I get some fresh air, and it does help. It really does. And I think if you first of all find what works for you and then encourage your team to do that for themselves, it's really, really important when we're thinking about keeping our team resilient and mentally strong. So I've talked about risk assessment, and I will do this, guys, because I jump around. I'm very passionate about mental health in the workplace, so it kind of just comes out. But the employer obligations are really clear in that the stress, the DSE assessments, you've got your desk assessments, like your equipment, everything works. So physically, you've got those. You've got the stress risk assessments, which I talked about, and those two are mandatory. The mental health risk assessments aren't mandatory, but they're the ones that I'm recommending actually do help more. So like I say, I can talk a little bit more about that later on if we've got time at the end. So I talked before about disability, and when we talk about legal obligations, this is where it's my forte, because I trained as a barrister, I am a solicitor, and I represent hundreds of people in tribunal, both employers and employees, and a lot of what we do is disability discrimination. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just talking about what a disability is, when it might be relevant to you, and also things to watch out for. So mental health can be a disability. You don't need a formal diagnosis in order for it to be under the definition. So the definition set out in Section 6 of the Equality Act. So a bit of boring law, but it'll all make sense in a minute. So there's a set definition that it has to meet, and it isn't disabled like a blue badge. It's disabled as in you've got to have had, the individual has to have had the symptoms for more than 12 months. And those symptoms must have had an impact that substantially affects their ability to do the day-to-day activities. So it's not just their work activities, it's day-to-day. So what we find with mental health is often people take medication. And what we have to look at when you're looking at disability is what it would be like if they didn't take the medication. It's what we call the deduced effect. It's really important that employers, because actually sometimes we'll be in the workplace and you think, oh, they look fine. But it is a hidden disability in the sense that we don't know when people are suffering from mental health all of the time, and especially if it's managed by medication, it's really important that that conversation happens. If you know that someone has a disability or has a mental health condition, you explore what the impact is and how long they've suffered with it, how it affects their ability to do their job, but also their day-to-day activities. So day-to-day activities could be affects their sleep, communication, socializing, concentration. It could be all sorts of things, and mental health conditions, even if they're the same, can affect people differently. So for example, I have anxiety and I suffer with panic attacks, but you might get someone else who doesn't have panic attacks, or they only have a panic disorder. And so even if you have the same diagnosis, it might manifest differently in an individual. So it's really important as a business that you actually think about that. So for example, if you've got an individual who has given you a sick note and said, I'm off sick for, it says on their anxiety and depression, and that's the first time you've ever found out about it. When they come back to work, you need to be exploring, well, how long has this been going on for? Are you on any medication? You can ask these questions. You're entitled to ask them. I think people often get a bit scared and like, oh, I don't want to ask the question, but you can ask it. And actually you're asking it for a reason, because you also want to assess, are there any adjustments that you can put in place, which I'll come on to. One thing I would say, and we are seeing loads of these claims at the moment, is Section 15 claims. So these are where, and it's a bit, I'm going to try and explain it as easy as possible. It's where an individual is dismissed because of something arising as a consequence of their disability. What does that mean? So arising as a consequence of their disability could be their sick leave. So what we often find is someone is off on long-term sick, and they are then selected for redundancy because they've had too much sick. And their dismissal is then discriminatory because that long-term sickness was because of mental health. So it's not that the employer is saying, you have mental health problems, I'm sacking you. It's that there's an indirect link because of something arising as a consequence of that disability. So it's really important when you're going through any objective justifications on criteria for selection processes, or if you're dismissing someone for capability, that you actually explore this as a risk, because what we're seeing at the moment is claims of this nature just flying through the tribunal and employers haven't even thought about it. So you could dismiss them fairly, but it could be discriminatory. And they don't need to have more than 2 years employment. They're entitled to not be discriminated against. Any individual is entitled to not be discriminated against at the point of application. You don't even have to be employed. So really do need to watch out for Section 15, because it is really important that you know about the nuances around that type of dismissal, because like I said, it could be a fair redundancy, but the reality is that they were selected because of something that was because of their disability, and that means that it could be a Section 15 claim. What I would say though is there is a defence to this, and if you objectively justify why you've selected them, then, so for example, if they're on long-term sick and they've been off for 6 months and you've got a letter back from the doctor says don't know when they're coming back, then you could objectively justify that you can't keep the role open indefinitely. So have a think about, if you are selecting someone and there is a risk there, can you objectively justify as a business why you have to do that? And if you can, then it may well be a defence to that type of claim. So the other thing that's really important is reasonable adjustments. I did allude to it earlier, and actually understanding what reasonable adjustments are can be a bit of a challenge, and actually it very much depends on each individual case. So what I would always say is you don't need to confirm someone has a disability to make an adjustment. I would always err on the side of caution and actually make adjustments if you think someone needs it, because it'll help them do their job. You don't need to go through the whole, I'm going to occupational health and I need to diagnose, I need them to confirm it. It's a legal question, so it's not something a medical practitioner can answer, firstly. Secondly, if it is likely to be a disability, so if they say they've got anxiety and they're really struggling at work, then ask them how you can alleviate some of that disadvantage by making an adjustment. They're not entitled to every adjustment that they request. It's got to be reasonable. And so what you need to do as an employer is understand, well, what is it that you need and how is it going to actually help? I think, there's sometimes people ask for a referral to occupational health, and that's not a reasonable adjustment. That's a request. That's not going to alleviate any substantial disadvantage in their role. However, if they said, oh, actually, I'd like to work from home because I really struggle with all the noise in the office, or actually I want flexible hours because I'm not sleeping very well, so sometimes I need to sleep a bit longer in the morning, that type of thing would be a reasonable adjustment. And what is reasonable also depends on not only the condition and how much it will alleviate and how much the adjustment will alleviate any disadvantage, but it's also relevant to the size and the administrative resources of the employer. And if you're a super tiny business with no one else in that role, and there's no flexibility from the individual, then it might not be reasonable to say they can just work whatever hours they want. And it's about putting in place what's reasonable for both the employer and the employee. The other thing I would say is that individuals, if you have an inkling that they have a mental health condition or that you think it might be a disability, be really mindful not to discriminate against them. It sounds obvious, but failing to make reasonable adjustments is discrimination. Dismissing them because of something arising as a consequence of their disability is discrimination. So it's about understanding that it isn't just because you say, oh, you have a mental health condition, you're sacked. It's a bit more nuanced than that, and there are other ways in which you can get caught out by the Equality Act if you're not careful. So, as employers then, I've talked about communication, and I'm going to actually pick up on this now, because I really do think it's important that we tailor our communication, and I'll give an example of what we did at Thrive. So when we first went into lockdown, and some of my staff have mental health problems, and we talk very openly about it, and that's just the culture that I've created, and I'm happy to, they're happy for me to share that. But the reality was everybody was affected differently, and some people really wanted to have a video call with me every day. Other people really didn't want that, and if anyone is like me, I'm getting very tired of Zoom calls, and you can become quite exhausted. And so tailoring that communication to the team and the individual is really, really important. So what we did, and this is obviously not for everybody, but we set up a WhatsApp group, and we found that reduced email, the volume of emails for all the little bits that you need to do. But it also meant we could voice note, which meant we could have conversations in the group, which meant everybody could hear what we were talking about at the time that was right for them. So if they were in the middle of a piece of work, the phone's not constantly ringing. It means that you can pick it up and have that conversational style of management that we had in the office, and that's worked really well. And when I did my appraisals, my staff said that was the best thing that we could have done, because they felt as though they weren't bothering me, because they knew that I would pick it up when I was free. But equally, it meant that everybody else knew what was happening, so it saved all of the kind of filling in everybody what's going on and sending loads of emails, because it was all in WhatsApp. And actually that's a really, really good, it just worked for us, and we are a really small team, so it did work really well. But just, it's an example to think about ways to communicate and actually streamline some of those processes. Another thing that we did, we found really helpful, was use Asana, which, there's loads of apps that you can use, but just to help with workflow. So rather than kind of constantly going, like if you're in the office, you'll go, oh, did you do that thing? Or can you just do this or whatever? You don't have that conversational approach anymore because you're at home, for example. If that's the case, using things like Monday.com or Trello or Asana are really helpful, because you can put the task in, assign it to the person, and it tells you when that person has to have it done by. They can ask a question on the task, and then you can respond. And once once it's done, they click it and you get a notification to say it's done. So it saves a lot of that follow-up and chasing, which can come across as micromanaging when you don't know what's happening. And I think it's really important that as business owners, we understand that at the moment, people are feeling pretty rubbish, pretty vulnerable. And it's more than just what's a legal requirement. I talked before about disability and understanding the legal definition. But the reality is, if you know someone's suffering or know someone needs help, don't wait for them to prove that they legally need it. Think about how that would make them feel. And people will remember how you made them feel, because we've been through an incredibly difficult year, and people are reflecting. People are spending a lot of time on their own with their own thoughts. And so having that more human approach with your leadership is really, really helpful to kind of pull you back out of what has been, well, like I say, one of the most difficult years that I've experienced in business, and I'm sure that many have. The final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of what people need is about flexible working for the future. And the reason I talk about this is because pre-COVID, employers took the view that, or not all employers, there are some that didn't take this view, but the majority of employers took the view that you can't work from home because I can't see what you're doing and it's not productive, it just doesn't work for us. And this was a real problem for people who had mental health problems, because one of the adjustments that is often very common is to ask for flexible working or home working, because people with mental health problems generally find it easier because they've got less distractions, and they just find that if they can manage their own workflow in their own time and at their own pace, then it's a lot less overwhelming. So what we found was, before lockdown, this really didn't ever occur, and you really had to fight for it as a reasonable adjustment, and employers were really reluctant to do it because they just didn't want to do it, and they didn't want to open the floodgates to everybody, even though it wouldn't. And that's gone, because now we've found that employers have had to adapt. They've forced their staff to work from home, and actually some people have done really, really well from home, and if anything, have come into their own because they've got into their little routine. So if an employee comes to you with a flexible working request in the future, you need to think really carefully if you're going to reject it, especially if they've already worked from home. I think we're going to see a massive revolution in terms of how we work. whether that's flexible working, remote working, or having that choice to, I call it smart working. So my staff, and the way I set my company up was, people can work when and where they want, as long as they get the work done. And what that means is, you know, they can come in the office as and when they want. I still have an office, but it's more a collaborative space where people can go and do whatever they need to do in terms of working as a team, or if they want just a quiet space, if they've got a housemate and they don't want to be working with them. So it gives people that flexibility and it gives them that ownership and responsibility. So I call that smart working, because it's not just home working or just flexible working. It's actually just working smart. It's working the best way for each individual, and everybody works differently. So, for example, I work from 5 a.m. in the morning, and people call me crazy for that, but my brain works so much better in the morning, and I get to the evening and then I can do things like webinars and do things where it's more talking than reading. And I just know that that works best for me. But I know some of my staff prefer to work later, so they definitely don't log on they don't log even on before 9, but I'll always see them on slightly later, because that just works for them. So understanding that flexibility isn't necessarily that someone's trying to fob you off, or they're trying to get away with working, and they're probably trying to work at a time that's best for them, which means that in turn they should be more productive. So just be mindful for that for the future. Oh, near the end. Any questions so far? Let's have a look. Is Danny going to come on and help me? Have a look.
Sorry, yes, I will do. I was listening.
Yeah, no, it's all right. I'm just having a look at the questions.
Now, when I come back is when everyone seems to drop off. The questions are, there's a few questions, and I think it's really interesting. I think the big question is from Bethan, and that was in relation to the Equality Act.
Yeah.
And it's really, I think she says it's really interesting to learn that you don't have to have a diagnosis to potentially be covered under the Equality Act.
Yeah, do you know what? It's very common that people think that you have to have a diagnosis. The actual definition says a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial adverse effect. It doesn't say you have to have a diagnosis, and that's really important.
That's really interesting. Because I think a lot of people do rely on that diagnosis, don't they?
Yeah.
Whereas actually it's that long-standing impact, I guess.
Yeah, and someone might not know that they have a condition, but the employer ought to reasonably know that they have a condition. And it's a bit of a strange one when it comes to knowledge. So with disability discrimination, the duty only arises when the employer knows or should have known. And one of the things where they should have known might be that they've got a sick note for stress, and the stress means that they've been off and they've had performance issues, so they can see this as a substantial impact, but they don't have a diagnosis. Now, I'm not saying that stress necessarily is a disability, but that means you are on notice that there's a problem, so you should be investigating. And that's the point when you get people involved and actually start talking and trying to understand whether it is a mental health condition and whether it has that substantial and adverse effect that you need to meet that definition.
Interesting. I hope that's answered your question, Bethan. We've got a couple more questions. Will the slides and handouts be available? Yes, a recording will be available after the event. So you'll be able to come back in and view that. Liz has asked, where do we find the mental health assessment which employees complete online?
Yeah, so with the mental health assessment, do you mean the stress one or the mental health or well-being? I presume it's the second. I think
it would be the mental health and well-being.
Yeah, so it's a company called Champion Health. They offer, I think they call it a well-being assessment. I call it a risk assessment because actually it manages risk really well. I'll tell you what, I'll send you their details so that you can forward it out with the slides.
Perfect, that sounds really good. Yeah, I'll send that out afterwards. Claire's asked how many staff you've got, Jodie.
How many staff? Well, actually, I've got 6 staff. I've just taken on a new partner, and I've got several consultant lawyers as well.
There's a couple of questions here that may well be more specific advice. So someone's asked someone's been asked to use their annual leave instead of being off sick with a mental health problem. This feels wrong, is it?
Yeah, I know, I agree with that. I think so the first thing is your holiday should be used to rest. If you have to take holiday when you're sick, you're not resting. So under the working time regulations, you're entitled to 4 weeks And actually, it's really important that you take that to rest. So I would always advise employers not to do that. The legislation's quite clear in that you can carry holiday over if you were too sick to take it. Sometimes if employees ask to take holiday because they want the money, then they can take it. But you shouldn't be asked by your manager. It should be the other way around. If you want to take it, then that's your choice, but you shouldn't be forced to do that. So you can raise that as a grievance if you're concerned that you're being forced to use that. You should be on sick leave. So you should either get SSP, which is statutory sick pay, or company sick pay if you're eligible, but check your contract.
Perfect. Another question asks us about, will there be handouts and slides?
Yeah.
And the other one is about your working practices.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I'm not sure if you've seen that one, which is
yeah, no, exactly. So I get up. So I get up at 5. I work from 5 till about 9 o'clock. I then take about an hour and a half to 2 hour break. I go walk the dog. I get showered. I get ready, and then I come back to work. And then I work for the afternoon. But I'm generally in meetings, and I don't work. This is very rare that I do anything past 6, 7 o'clock. But like I say, I have that big gap in the middle. So I do all the bulk of my work first thing in the morning. And then I do my walk, my exercise, my shower and everything else at about 10ish. So it breaks it up quite nicely, actually. And it means that I get all my self-care in because I do all the important stuff first, in terms of like my legal drafting and any advice that clients need. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's the opposite of what I promote. I work flexibly. I don't work consistently for that entire time. Otherwise I'd burn out.
I was going to say that's a long working day otherwise, isn't it? So hopefully that's answered that question.
I do actually finish early quite a lot as well. If there's a webinar, because a lot of the time people want webinars after work. So I generally will do those after work, but most of the time I'm finished before 5 o'clock. And although that does look like 12 hours, you've still got your gaps in the day and doing all sorts of other bits and going out with the dog. So do my washing, that kind of thing. You can when you're at home, can't you? It's great.
Absolutely. And another question is from Matt. Although legally there is only health and safety required risk assessments, such as stress-related risk assessments, DSC, surely the Management of Health and Safety at Work regs should potentially cover any foreseeable risks, including mental ill health and conditions.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why, from a compliance perspective, we encourage people to actually go further than what the basic health and safety stuff is, because the reality is, and you get this a lot with stress at work claims. I'm not a specialist in this area. It's a personal injury type claim. But if you can foresee a risk, then you and actually that employee then has a decline in their mental health or tries to take their own life or whatever happens, it could be a stress at work claim. And like I say, it's way outside my scope because it's personal injury. But you're right in that foreseeable risk could include mental health and stress.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And lastly, someone's just come back on Bethan's point, which was the terminology is commonly used can be something along the lines of, from the information provided, person is likely to be afforded protection under the Equality Act due to the effects of medication or the impact the condition has on functional day-to-day activity, etc. However, the ultimate decision can only be made in a court of law or similar.
Yeah, so let me just reread that. It was quite a long one. So
yeah, sorry.
Terminology commonly used is along the lines of, yeah. So I mean, the reality is, it's a judge that decides. It's a legal question, and it's based on the application of the law to the facts. And so a medical practitioner will often say, it's likely that they meet this criteria, but I can't answer that question. And even a lawyer will, because ultimately it's up to the judge or the tribunal panel that are sitting if it goes to a tribunal. I mean, the reality is, though, we don't want to be there. We want to be proactive and preventative. And that's the whole point of actually considering this early doors. But yeah, you're right. Ultimately the decision can only be made in a tribunal.
Thank you very much.
And someone's asked about my sleep. I love that. I love my sleep.
I'll be honest, I was going to skip that question.
No, I'm taking that one. I'm taking that question. So no, I'm taking that because it is really important and it's a good question, because I go to bed very, very early. I'm very tired by the end of the day, so I'm in bed by like 8, 9 o'clock. People are like, why do you go to bed so early? And it's because I get up early. So I just do what works best for me. I don't really watch much TV. I'm not really bothered about doing that on an evening. So, or I might have a bit of a box set occasionally, but but actually I don't watch soaps or anything like that. So I'm happy to just go for a walk or just read a book and then go to bed after work. So once I've done that, by the time I finish work, had my tea and done that, I just go, yeah, head to bed. So I do get my sleep. Always need that, guys. When you've got a mental health problem, I know that. I learned the hard way.
And I think this will be the last question that we'll ask. And Andrea's asked, for the Equality Act, is a 12 months of symptoms start from when they noticed the mild onset, or is it when it started to have a significant impact?
So it's not necessarily when they start, it's about that consistency. So sometimes people will fluctuate, and actually they might have, I don't know, 3 months where they have depression, and then they don't have anything for 9 months, and then they have 3 months again. So that wouldn't necessarily meet the criteria. It's continuously having a substantial impact for a period of 12 months, or likely to last 12 months. So just because they've only just recently got an onset, it doesn't mean that it's not going to last 12 months. So just bear that in mind. It's not necessarily for the full 12 months. It's 12 months or likely to last.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jodie.
Okay.
Just like to take this time just to thank you for your time tonight. As you say, you don't normally work till this late, so I'm guessing we've stretched you a little bit, so
Yeah,
we do
appreciate
it. Thank you very much, everybody. We will be sharing the recordings and further information after this event. If you do require a certificate of attendance, please do let me know. We do have just a quick poll. If you can share that, Jodie, that would be brilliant. If you can use that.
How do I share
we are
it?
looking, if you just click on it.
Just click the poll. Okay.
We are looking at running some more sessions in the new year, funnily enough, talking about disability and a bit more information from Jodie around disability and employment law's impact on occupational health.
Yeah.
Those dates will be launched over the next couple of weeks, so please keep your eye out on the website. I hope that everyone's enjoyed it, and if you have any topics that you'd particularly like us to cover, please do reach out and let us know, because we are delivering a number of these over the next few weeks and into 2021, as I say. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you.
Has that poll come up? Sorry, I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. That's fine. I just didn't know if it had worked. I can see it, but
yeah, no, it's come up for me as well, so I hope everyone else has seen it.
Brilliant. I don't think anyone's done it yet. That's what I was wondering. Okay.
Yeah, that might be the one.
Perfect. Just checking if there's any. So if anyone's got any final questions, happy to answer them. If not, my details will be on the slides that come out. We do have our own wellbeing platform. If anyone does want free access to complete any mental health training, you're welcome to access that as well. Just contact me. And if anyone's got any specific questions that they didn't want to ask publicly, we have a coronavirus helpline where you can ask that, and it's free. So just fire over. It doesn't have to be mental health related. You can fire over any questions that are burning but you didn't want to post them on here. And then just a quick shout out for our Thrive Club, which Danny and I are both in. If anyone's in HR or people management, please join our Thrive Club. It's free, and we basically post loads of free stuff about mental health, HR, furlough, redundancy, you name it, it's in there. And there's just a really supportive group of people. It's just on Facebook, and obviously the link is on there. So when you get the slides, you can join. Thank you. Let's have a look at the polls. Okay. So do you think your business manages mental health or risks well? 64% of people saying yes. It's good. It's going up. Oh, I'll leave it a minute. That's good. Okay. Does your business provide occupational health or EAP type services? Lots of people saying yes, which is really positive. So many people that come to us have like nothing in place at all. So that's really good. Do you think the second lockdown has had an impact on your team's mental health? Yeah, 90% is pretty much the same every time I do this type of webinar. Do you think the second lockdown has had an impact on your mental health? Less people saying on their mental health than on their teams. Interesting. Has your business provided any training relating to mental health this year? For example, mental health, first aiders, awareness, etc. Yes, that's really good to see. 79% of people have still done that. What I've found is that because of the impact of COVID, sometimes companies haven't had the budget or haven't had the time to do it. So they've actually just not done anything on diversity, inclusion and mental health this year. So it's really positive to see such a high percentage of people investing in their teams. Has your company completed a stress or mental health risk assessment? Lots of people saying no, so that's really interesting. So hopefully off the back of this, you can see the benefits of doing those risk assessments. And like I say, I'm happy to share the details of who we use and some tips on how to engage on that. And then, would you be interested in learning bits from me? Oh, yay, lots of things, fabulous. Brilliant. Okay, I'll just check if there's any more questions, and then I think we're good.
Just a couple of comments saying thank you.
Oh,
Thank you very much. I'm really happy that everyone's found it so useful, to be fair. I've just dropped a link into the chat window for future webinars.
yeah,
That will be where the next webinars that we run with Jodie will be hosted. And you can just check those out on the website and
yeah,
register via the platform. Thank you for attending once again.
amazing.
I'll bring this session to a close.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye.